Welcome to another very special edition of Ask Octopus Brisbane edition. So we're all here and we've got Paul.
Hi everybody.
Founder of Octopus Deploy joining us. And today, instead of asking or answering customer questions, we're kind of going to talk about a little bit of the history of Octopus, where we came from, where we're going, and really get into more about what Bob, Derek, and I do. What is the technical account manager? What is customer success at Octopus, and what does it look like, over maybe the next 6 to 12 months? I think Paul started off with a little bit about, Octopus, where it came from, how you came up with it.
Yeah, sure. So Octopus started in sort of 2011, and it was this. I mean, you guys were developers at this time, right? So you remember how it was like you had source control, you had some way of building, and that might have been Subversion or Visual Source Safe or TFS or something. And so everyone kind of went through that, and then build servers became a thing. Because what used to happen is, prior to source control, two developers would be working on something, and the code would be on like a file share, and they would work on it for weeks at a time, and on their version of the code, and then at some point they would try to merge all that stuff together, and it would be a huge pain. So source control kind of helped to solve that and to solve the versioning of the changes. But then builds was still a problem because the code would work on your machine, but it wouldn't work on my machine. And so the solution to that was like, we'll set up another machine that as long as it builds on that, that's the blessed machine. It doesn't matter if it works on your machine, as long as it works on the build server, it's all good. But this is like the time when there wasn't the cloud and data centers were still a thing. And so at the end of a build, you had something you needed to deploy and make work somewhere. And as a consultant, I'd go from project to project, setting up source control, setting up builds, and then really struggling with getting stuff into production. And the thing I learned, I was fairly young at the time, so the thing I learned was that if you're not showing what you're building to an end user, to someone who can give you real useful feedback, you're just kind of keep working on the wrong thing. Agile kind of helps you work on things fast, but working on the wrong thing fast isn't really getting you anywhere. So deploying something into test environments, production environments was a huge part of trying to do successful projects, but deployment was hard. So Octopus was kind of born out of that. But my vision of that at the time was like a project would have, or an Octopus instance would have 3 or 4 environments, dev, test, prod, and would be used by a team of maybe 10 people and deployed a few dozen machines at most. And this weird thing kind of happened after sort of 2014, 15, where teams that had started using Octopus standardized on it and rolled it out across these really large organizations. So I think you've done the previous interview with the team at Accenture, where they had hundreds of teams all relying on this big one Octopus server that was kind of struggling performance-wise. And so that kind of fast forwards to your role, right, as technical account managers, where you're working with some of our largest customers to try and make sure that that they're achieving what they're setting out to achieve using Octopus, but having it perform well, work well, make sure that people understand how to use the product the best, not make mistakes, that sort of thing. So you're all additions to the team joining in 2018. What's been really wonderful is to see how many customers you've been able to impact so quickly, and the positive comments I get from customers. Customers who've been through this kind of went through a sense of like, Octopus is working really well for us, but it's slow or something's wrong. And I would get these emails that would get escalated to me, like outlining all these problems. And now I get emails kind of saying what a great company we are and what a great experience they've had because of the work you do. But most people may not know what technical account managers do, so maybe give them a bit of background as to what you guys do on a daily basis.
So, a technical account manager, often what we do is we're really just working with a lot of our customers, just getting eyes across what they're doing in Octopus. And what we do is that first call normally, it's a configuration review, because you do find some issues, and we saw some weird and wonderful configurations. And what it really does is, working with customers, you build up a bit of rapport, some trust, and from there, really, you just start looking over some of the stuff and work with them to configure it. There's sometimes you have to address some technical debt, but what we do is obviously jump on from a technical perspective and just give them some tips. Things actually start getting a little bit easier. Things get performing, because obviously one of the biggest issues that we have in the past is as we've scaled, some of the things there could have been better. And what we do is jump on and work with our customers to just make things a little bit easier for them.
Yeah, once we understand their setup too, we kind of know, we know how they're using it. We know what features they are like looking forward to, like new features coming out or what they're using. So if we see, maybe we see a bug report come in, we can kind of give them a heads up like, hey, hold off on doing an upgrade, or if they're on LTS, it's nothing to worry about anyway. But we can also say, hey, that feature that you've been waiting for just launched, Spacious just launched, Workers just launched, Kubernetes supports out. So we can kind of keep them up to date on those things that are coming out.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's really back to that education, because oftentimes customers have started back in 3.1 or 3.2, and so they don't know that tenants are a thing, and they can do multi types of authentication or anything like that. So it's kind of really interesting. So
thank you.
Yeah,
see you.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a little bit of that, going back and forth with that stuff. Really teaching them, like the versioning rules for channels. I helped a customer recently set that up for the first time. He actually got to see that in action. He was really super excited about it. So it's kind of cool to watch that.
Yeah, you'll notice there's like customers that do know Octopus very well, but they don't know everything about it. I think it's like, it's big enough now. You mentioned it was like the original plan, it was for small teams, small projects, and now it's like grown to do a lot of stuff. And not everybody needs every feature, but not everybody knows about every feature. Where, you know, we come in, we say, oh, did you know about your setting your retention policy? Did you know about channel versioning rules? Did you know about tenancy? We can really show them, and from, you know, we have a good level of knowledge with it, so we can actually give them information about how to use it and how to use it effectively.
What's funny is sometimes you see customers will start out like, this was a proof of concept that's grown into production. So they're running stuff on production that's, say, still a SQL Express database. So they're like, oh, how do I lift and shift over to an actual production SQL cluster? How do I put it on an actual legitimate SQL instance, and how set up a bunch of virtual machines to handle everything like that? So.
Yeah, and it really depends on the type of the customer, because if it's somebody who's been using Octopus for a couple years, they're established, they're set up, we're really just kind of helping them get better at using it from an existing standpoint. But if you have a customer that's like onboarding new teams, that's a chance to work with them directly and actually get their project set up the best way the first time.
I've done it myself. You know, when I first started using Octopus back in 2013, I jumped in and you know, I had that exact same issue myself. It's funny, I could have probably been doing with a technical account manager myself.
So you start working with a customer, you get an understanding of what their goals are, and you review how they're using Octopus. Give me the top, let's say the top 3 things, you can do one each, of common issues you find, or common themes of things that are causing customers pain.
Retention policies. Not having retention policies set is probably like the first thing, because they may have had their Octopus Deploy server for, now it's probably going on 5 years, and they have now 200, 300,000 releases, and all that stuff is in the database. You know, a 5-year-old release, it's not really useful at this particular point in time. It's just taking up space, taking up performance hit. So once they start configuring that, it's helping them configure that, but configure that in an intelligent way. So we had a customer who set retention policies, go, oh, I just want those 3 recent releases. Well, a weekend later, it was about 10% of the way done. It's like, maybe you should go a little bit less intense on the first go.
Step by step.
Yeah, one I see a fair amount is, I don't know, it's just having more environments than what feels like is the right amount. Like it was planned for 4 environments, like dev, QA, staging, production. And if you're getting, like, you can make some cases where maybe you have a few QA environments, a few dev environments, but once you get beyond like 7 to 8, it's like, start seeing pain in the UI where it's like a lot of horizontal scrolling, and it's not just modeled in the most effective way. And usually that's where I come in and say, well, maybe there's a better way to model this. Like, why are there so many environments? Are we prefixing those with product names? Like, really, they should be sharing, like dev should be dev for each project. Dev should be dev for each team. And why do you want them separated? If it's security reasons, say, like we actually just don't want them to share those environments, the targets to be in the same environment. Now we have spaces, so those teams can have their own spaces, so they'll actually be physically split in the interface. Or if it's more just a modeling thing where we didn't know that like customers have their own environments, but we didn't know how to use tenants effectively. Add in tenants, and now you've kind of taken away the need for more than one dev environment.
Also saw data center, like so you'd see prod data center in Omaha, Nebraska, another prod data center in Dallas Fort Worth, another one in Scotland. So they would have a unique environment for each one, and like, well, you can more effectively use say tenants to solve that problem as well.
Project coordination recently that's really helped because what it was is I had a customer recently who had something like 120 steps in a deployment. It's like it's funny because it was like, you know, it worked. They had a lot of success with it, but just what they could do is really just separate it out a little bit, and then that way what I generally found is there's less likely to have any issues, you know, less likely of a failed deployment as well. Yeah, that's one of my big ones. It's maybe not something I see all the time, but like that, it's, you know, just getting there and doing a bit of education.
Because I mean, they could do, if they did a deployment, if they made a change to say just a front end website, that entire process would have to run with all 20 steps. So that's really slowing them down too.
Yeah. And that's something that we added in the last year. That's the deploy a project step.
Yep.
So that's something new that maybe people aren't aware that's been added in yet, or maybe they haven't upgraded to a version that includes that.
Well, that's it. What I do, I've done it myself in the past with Octopus, is you generally can sometimes have it where you're so set in your ways of using it, you use cases over and over. Actually having the technical account manager there just to give you the bit of nudge, just to let you know about new features. You know, like Azure Web Apps, I've done a whole bunch of stuff in that in the past, and then suddenly it became a target, and everything became a lot easier as well. So I've been through that pain myself.
So some of these pain points are caused by the way Octopus is being used and not taking advantage of certain features. And often that's because those features didn't exist when the company started using Octopus. So some of that you solve by giving guidance. What about the stuff that you can't solve with guidance, but kind of does come back to a product issue? I'm thinking specifically of like performance related things where people are using a lot of something that we weren't expecting there to be a lot of. So things like environments, projects, doing a lot of deployments. How do you go about solving those things? Do you guys fix those? Do you work with the team that we are here in Australia to fix those? And what does that kind of process look like?
So typically with that, what we'll try to triage as best we can. First, we'll ask for the logs, the diagnostic logs, and ask them to turn on trace logging so we can see all the SQL queries that it's running and get the performance metrics that way. And maybe you can also ask for a .NET or .trace profile. And that seems to solve some of the problems. We're going to identify certain things like, oh, you might need to rebuild your index, or you might need to add an index here that we don't have in the vanilla default Octopus install. But this would help you out in this particular case, and that's perfectly fine. But in other cases, it's not as clear. So I think, Derek, you had like a customer that we've had to work with that had a rather large database.
Yes, it was in the region of 170 gig.
That's a big one.
It was massive. We worked with that customer, and I actually I paired up with one of the developers locally. Certainly, I'm not touching any of the product from a development perspective, but obviously making sure that was just ticking along nicely. And what we've found is that's really helped. That's really actually got, it's great working with the guys. In actual fact, it's great being here in Brisbane. You know, we come out twice a year, and it's great because we actually get to catch up on that. But we also pair up and work with the guys here who are actually developing on the product. Yeah.
So they sanitize their data. We found out we have a way to sanitize the database, and they sent it to us, though, like a backup of the database.
Yes.
So, okay. So then we started using it actually in our whole deployment process. Then our SDLC actually started including performance tests around that now.
Yeah, well, that's it. With a recent release, we're rebuilding indexes after the upgrade, which is, we saw obviously, it's led to a lot of performance improvements. Because ultimately, what would happen sometimes is you would get to the end of the upgrade process, the database has changed quite considerably, and then now it's been rebuilt, and things have just. There's an initial slowdown after an upgrade, but it's really helped.
Yeah, it is a lot of like getting the logs, like, or maybe a memory dump from the PowerShell process, something that we can take back to the team, say, hey, this is the situation, this is what they were trying to do, this is the behavior they experienced. And then also, like, because we do have the relationship, we can kind of answer some questions that the engineers may have. So if they like, okay, well, what kind of, is it polling or listening tentacles? Is it, what kind of configuration? Is it HA? Like how many nodes? Like what setup? We know a little bit about their setup, so we can kind of answer some of those questions that they may, like before they'd have to go back and forth, you know, from Australian time zone to UK or US.
Yeah, I think that's where I saw a lot of the benefits. Because we're actually having people in the regions now, is really, you know, cutting down, getting to the endpoint quicker and better. What's basically happened there is the customer are a lot happier, because really what they can do is even guidance as well. You know, just obviously give us a call or on Zoom on a non-specific video environment, conference software. But yeah, so that's it. I think it's like that is you build that rapport as well, and you're almost saw as an extension as part of the team. You know, we work with some customers we work really closely with, and some at the same time as they only want that minimal interaction, you know, a bit of guidance occasionally. So yeah.
What's really interesting is this last year we released Hosted Octopus, and we use Octopus Deploy to deploy Hosted Octopus for us. And so we had an ability to go ahead and like leverage, like we set up an HA cluster. I think it was a 4-node cluster in that particular sense. And so we saw some of these issues that our customers are experiencing as well. So that is a good way to dog food everything. So combined with all that stuff, I think in the last year, it's really helped with our performance.
Okay, and that's everything from Brisbane. We're all actually about to head off now and head home. So just want to say thanks for Paul for coming along, and it's great, obviously, spending some time with you guys. So yeah, just thanks.
Yeah, see y'all next time.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.